Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
I'm fuzzy on the whole good-bad thing. What do you mean bad?
Hello, welcome to the podcast. I'm joined with Chad Gross. How you doing, Chad?
Doing well. I'm having a good week and looking forward to this interview today.
Yes, the previous weeks we've talked a little bit about some of the various arguments for the existence of God, and we touched on the moral argument. And so we're going to have a guest talking about the moral argument. Here's a side note for you, Chad. Did you see over at Capturing Christianity, they did like a live stream of like over 100 arguments for the existence of God?
I did see that. I didn't watch it yet, but I did see that they did that. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. It's like, wow, that's awesome. I have to look at that.
It kind of harkens back to that whole question that we were asking answering in the one podcast about when people say there are no evidence or no good arguments for God's existence.
Yeah,
that might give them something to think about over there.
Have you seen this link? Can I forward you a link? So that's good to see them doing that. And yeah, I can't wait to check that out. I don't know how long it took them, but that's awesome. But today we're going to be focusing on the moral argument. And our guest today is Dr. David Baggett. He's a professor of philosophy and director of the Center for Moral Apologetics at Houston Baptist University. Did you know he's got a lot of books out, Chad?
I do know that he's got a lot of books out, but
yes.
I am especially interested in his book about the moral argument, though.
Yes, well, I've got one called The Morals of the Story, in which he's co-authored that with his wife, Mary Beth. I know you want to ask him questions about, hey, what's it like to be married to a fellow academic and writing a book together? That's awesome. So that's a book about moral arguments, good news about a good God. And it's written in a different sort of way, even though we're talking about them being academics.
I would say that one of the things it's written about is it's pretty entertaining. It definitely injects their senses of humor into there. So it's not in a sense a dry kind of academic approach. Also, I like the way that it's unapologetic about being apologetic, meaning that it is an apologetics book. It's a philosophy book, but it's also kind of maps out how the moral argument can be handy and used in evangelism. So I think those things kind of make it unique in that sense. Yeah.
So he's the co-author with Jerry Walls of the book Good God, The Theistic Foundations of Morality. That book won Christianity Today's 2012 Apologetics Book of the Year award. So, and then in 2016, he published a sequel with Walls that critiques naturalistic ethics called God and the Cosmos, Moral Truth and Human Meaning. Then a third book in the series, The Moral Argument, A History, 2019. That's a chronicle of the history of moral arguments for God's existence. That'd be an awesome read. Haven't got that yet.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you see these books and you're like, I just, you add them all to your like Amazon cart or something. You're like, I need to read all of these. So they're even going to do a fourth book on the topic of moral realism. So we've already talked about his book with his wife, The Morals of the Story, but he's also co-edited a collection of essays exploring the philosophy of C.S. Lewis. And he's also edited the third debate between Gary Habermas and Anthony Flew on the resurrection. So cool stuff. Some things I didn't know. The purpose for the interview, we're going to find out more about his work, discuss the moral arguments, find out what's going on with HBU's apologetics program. That's Houston Baptist University. They have an apologetics program. We did an interview previously about Biola's program. We want to find out all about the different programs out there. We'll do the hard work so that you can find the info you need to sign up.
We have the tools. We have the talent.
Yes. I wish there was a steady paycheck in it.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Well, joining us is David Baggett. Thanks for joining us for the podcast today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, guys.
Well, we got in touch with you this week, and we were interested in what was going on over at HBU, Houston Baptist University, about their apologetics program. When you came back to me, I was so excited because there's all this other stuff we wanted to talk about as well. Your books about the moral argument, I even wanted to ask you questions about Harry Potter. So we'll get into that first. First, maybe just for our listeners, can you tell a bit about your background and your Christian life and training in philosophy?
Sure. So I grew up in Michigan, was saved at a young age, went to college at the University of Michigan, taught at a private high school for a year, then went off to Asbury Seminary. By the end of seminary, I knew I wanted to get a PhD in philosophy, which I eventually did at Wayne State. And I wrote on the Euthyphro dilemma. And that's from an early Socratic dialogue, of course, pertaining to this connection between the gods or God and morality, holiness and justice and piety and all of that business. And then after graduation, I taught for 4 years at King's College up in Northeast Pennsylvania, then moved on to Liberty in Virginia, and I was there for 14 years. And I met my lovely wife, and then she and I this past summer moved to Houston Baptist, and she teaches English, and I teach philosophy and apologetics. And we're very happy to be here. And I'll also have an opportunity while here to start and run a newly formed Center for Moral Apologetics. That's kind of my area, the moral argument, moral apologetics, and that sort of thing. So we're really excited to get this project underway, and we've already taken some initiative and first steps, but we're really hoping to make HBU the epicenter of cutting-edge research on the moral argument, and it's exciting to be part of that. So that's me in a nutshell.
A lot of great things come out of Michigan. I'm from Michigan myself, oddly. Where are you from Michigan?
Oh, neat. I grew up in Dearborn Heights.
Okay. I honestly have been away from Michigan so long, I don't really know how far things are from each other anymore.
Right. I grew up about 10 miles west of Detroit.
Very good.
Whenever I meet anyone from Michigan, my wife always pokes fun at me because I always get very excited. And she says, you Michigan people are inexplicably proud of your heritage as Michiganders. She says, I'm from Maryland. It's not like that at all with us.
If your state was shaped like a mitten and you could show everybody where you live just by pointing at your hand, you'd be excited too,
I think that's an excellent point.
I actually live in Maryland right now. Yeah,
okay.
So all kinds of connections here. So obviously at Apologetics 315, we're interested in apologetics. So could you tell listeners a little bit about kind of what they'd experience if they were on the campus of HBU, and then also a bit about your Master's of Arts in Apologetics degree?
Oh, yeah. So HBU, it's been really growing over the last several years, and in the apologetics program in particular, the faculty is really top notch. We just have a number of great apologists and wonderful thinkers and marvelous teachers to choose from. So it's increasingly an exciting community to be part of here in Houston, which is one of the most cosmopolitan areas of the country. So it was all new for me, just having moved here this past summer, but I've been very pleasantly surprised. There are two things about Houston I don't like. It's very hot. Extremely, freakishly hot in the summer, and then the drivers, especially truck drivers, I swear this is how I'm going to die. Oh yeah, huh. I've never seen anything like it. So be on guard against the bad driving in Houston. Other than that, I love the place and love the new school. It's under very godly leadership. I think they have a real vision for ministry and for outreach and for education, quality education. There's a lot of classical education that goes on here, a lot of reading of great texts, and the philosophy department is terrific. My wife's part of the English department, and that's wonderful. And the School of Christian Thought is just so exciting. We have so many wonderful theologians and Bible scholars and classicists, and that's where the apologetics department is housed. And we have faculty like Nancy Percy and Bruce Gordon and William Lane Craig and Michael Ward and Mike Lacona,
wow,
Mary Jo Sharp, Phil Talent. I mean, it just goes on and on. It really is an incredibly talented place. So yeah, I think students have a great opportunity, if they're at all interested in studying these things, to avail themselves of HBU.
You mentioned the Center for Moral Apologetics as part of HBU. How's that related? And is it different, or is it just a different sort of something that goes in tandem with that program? How's that structured?
Yeah, it's sort of alongside. It's the HBU has various centers that they have begun. And this is one that I wanted to start for some years, and I wrote Dr. Sloan about it several years ago, and he got excited about the vision for it and really wanted to make it happen as soon as it was, financially practicable. I've had the vision for something like this Center for Moral Apologetics, honestly, for about 15 years. And at my previous school, I had approached the leaders about it repeatedly, and it just never happened to, come about there. And that's okay. It just maybe wasn't the right fit, but it's a perfect fit for HBU. And so the center is going to be the sort of the central hub of cutting edge research on the moral argument. We eventually hope to offer a certificate program that will be starting summer after next in moral apologetics. And that can wrap into a master's in apologetics for those who wish to do that. We'll make classes available also for people to take, of course, not just residentially, but online all over the country and really all around the world. The certificate program will feature basically the 4 classes on various dimensions of the moral argument. So it'll really be a deep dive, and it will give the folks who are participating in it an opportunity to fellowship with one another and really be involved in a community. It's not just a class to kind of take and be done with. It'll be over 2 summers, and in the intervening year, they'll be in communication and in touch with one another, extending their understandings and helping one another sharpen in this area. We really want to provide an education to produce, world-class premier defenders of various versions of the moral argument. We're excited to do that. We have started Moral Apologetics Press. We'll be putting out books. We're going to generate curricula. We're going to do outreach to other college campuses using the resources and the template of moral apologetics. There are just a number of initiatives underway. And of course, hopefully, we'll be doing conferences and producing a lot of scholarships for students who are interested but might not have the means to study these things. We want to put on lectureships, and the list goes on and on. It's a big vision, but we're excited to move in that direction step by step.
That sounds phenomenal. That's a lot of stuff I didn't know, had no clue about. I've heard that HBU's program deals a lot with cultural apologetics. Now, can you speak to that? What's available in that aspect as well?
Yes. One of the really distinctive features of HBU's Masters in Apologetics is that students have the opportunity to take classes in both cultural apologetics and philosophical apologetics. And if they wish to study both, they can do that. There's a common core between the 2 tracks, where students take, research and writing in philosophy, religion, a mere Christian theology and apologetics implications, scripture and apologetics implications, that sort of thing. All the students in the program will take those core classes. And then there's sort of a departure, right? So the folks who want to study more cultural apologetics, they'll take things like modern and postmodern culture, and C.S. Lewis and imaginative apologetics, and things like this, right? What's happening with cultural apologetics is there's a little bit more of an emphasis on the non-philosophical stuff, right? So it's not just the discursive analysis. They want to get into things like, literature and the imagination, various cultural aspects. And this is very exciting because it seems to me when apologetics is really done well, it's the combination, right, of the philosophical side, the rigorous, disciplined, principled, discursive stuff on the one hand, and on the other hand, the imaginative, the literary, the relational, the aesthetic. I mean, Phil Talon has written The Poetics of Evil. He's really one of the foremost defenders of kind of an aesthetic variant of the moral argument. And we have Nancy Percy, who's this profound, culture critic. William Lane Craig comes in and teaches. My goodness, we have work on the historicity of the resurrection with Mike Licona. We have brilliant literary criticism and cultural apologetics with someone like Michael Ward, just really an incredible set of resources that people can tap into where they really can see wedded both, rationality and the imagination. And they can get trained in both areas, and they can really see how fertile is their combination.
Yeah. I'm wondering, as I'm listening to that demarcation there between the cultural and philosophical and how they go together, and I agree completely that the best case scenario is that it's a both and. But one of the things we've kind of seen and we've learned through doing some other interviews is that kind of the questions about Christianity are changing. In other words, it used to be that people would ask questions kind of, is Christianity true? Nowadays, the questions are more beginning to become, is Christianity good? And would you agree that kind of cultural versus philosophical apologetics kind of addresses both of those questions? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think that both questions are so important, and they are. The emphasis does tend to be a little bit different. A great example of the integration that's possible here is: do you all remember C.S. Lewis when he said the story of Jesus and the death and the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus is the true myth, right? Remember this language? Now, think about what he's saying here, right? First, he's saying it was true. It was historically accurate. It was reliable. It was veridical. And we have a wonderful case that we can make using, say, historical apologetics and such. And Lacuna does that kind of work. Gary Habermas, of course, my old colleague at Liberty, does that sort of work impeccably well. And that's powerful. But he says it's true, but it's the true myth. In other words, mythical and the true understanding of the world. It answers to our deepest needs. It inspires us both in our heads and in our hearts, right? It appeals to us at our deepest levels, relationally, aesthetically. So these imaginative components are best seen as combined with the philosophical questions of discursive truth and demonstration. That's one example of the way in which both kinds of questions can be asked. Because as apologists, it seems to me increasingly we're going to be in a position where we have to be able to answer both questions about truth and also questions about goodness, of meaning, and existential sorts of questions and so forth. And of course, Christianity provides very compelling answers to all of these questions, right? And so depending on your audience, depending on the context, the more trained you are to be able to answer both kinds of questions, the more effective an apologist you'll be as you're empowered by God's Spirit to be so. But like Lewis, he was very much trained in both, you might say, right? I mean, he studied the greats at Oxford, so he was very steeped in history and the classics and philosophy. Yeah. And he also studied, things like literary criticism and great literature. And I think it's one of the reasons why he was, such the preeminent apologist that he was.
Yeah. For those who are listening who might be thinking, wow, this sounds cool, cultural apologetics, moral apologetics. Wait a minute. How would you define cultural apologetics or moral apologetics? Is that just taking a defense of the faith from a different angle? And if so, how would you describe that angle, especially with a cultural apologetic? Because for me, I can imagine a moral apologetics focusing on certain moral arguments, but when it comes to cultural apologetics, I'm a little fuzzy.
Yeah. Well, in I don't primarily teach in the cultural apologetics area. I'm more of the philosophical, more on the philosophical side, but in the cultural apologetics area, they're really keen on emphasizing the connections between reason and the imagination.
Yes. Okay.
Right. And students have an opportunity to study, say, with like Holly Ordway. She's going to be teaching a course this summer on Tolkien, or Michael Ward, who wrote Planet Narnia. But it's this recognition that we're more than sort of like just logic choppers as human beings, right? We're deeply relational, aesthetic creatures. And there are all sorts of things that can appeal to us, right? And for some people, maybe a strict, tight discursive argument's the way to go. That's the way in which you're going to best appeal to them, right? But for others, and for many, right, you need to appeal to sort of a broader swath of their human inclinations. We are imaginative creatures. So how is it that literature might point the way to God, right? Or even popular culture? How can popular culture point to God? In this way, it actually does remind me of an aspect of my past. When I was at King's College, when I first went there, William Irwin was teaching, my buddy Bill Irwin, and he's the guy who started the philosophy and culture series. And it was an effort to take pieces of popular culture like The Simpsons or Seinfeld or what have you, and use that as a springboard to get people excited about thinking about questions of philosophy. And it was really a wonderful sort of vision, right? And it's done very well over the years. Well, in a similar sort of way, I think imaginative apologetics can start with where people are, with their interests, with their inclinations, with their existential questions, and use things like literature, great literature and popular culture and the like, to address those questions and bring to bear the resources of Christianity in answering those questions. It's a recognition that there's more to apologetics than just the arguments. The arguments are important, the philosophical arguments, they really are, and I encourage people to do as much as they can to get trained in that area. It really bothers me when people say, I'm not really a philosophical type, so I'm just going to do all the cultural stuff, right? And for that matter, it bothers me when people say, there's nothing to this other, I just want to focus on the philosophical side. I mean, I really love to see people emphasize both. There is a conceptual distinction here between them, but they're organically related. Sometimes I actually use the analogy of their kind of like the two legs with which we walk, the two legs with which we walk through apologetics. Yeah, we're more than logic choppers, but truth matters. Keep thinking in terms of that Lewisian example of the true myth, and I think you're closing in on what this bifurcation is all about.
I do want to transition here in a minute over to talking a bit more about the moral apologetics, but just to wrap up what we're saying about HBU. You mentioned some distance opportunities for people. Obviously, there's the different programs they can do certificates in and whatnot, but what sort of opportunities are there with distance learning there?
Yeah, in fact, if somebody wants to get an MA in apologetics from HBU, if they wish or if they need to, they can take the entire thing online. So they wouldn't even actually have to be here residentially or locally. So if you want to avoid the heat, you want to avoid the traffic, you can do that. We, of course, would love to see more and more people come to campus. But yeah, sometimes people just don't have the option. They have a career going on elsewhere, and they need to do it all online, and that's an option. So you can do it all online if you wish, pretty much anywhere around the world. And European students have the added advantage of having for their advisor Michael Ward. So that's kind of
cool.
Neat. That's kind of a neat benefit.
Chad, I know you wanted to maybe kick off some of the questions for the moral side of things. So
so the book that I'm most interested in talking to you about is the one you co-authored with actually your wife in 2018. Yeah. The morals of the story, good news about a good God. And really, before even asking about any of the content of the book, I wanted to know kind of what is it like to not only be married to an academic, but also to write a book with that person.
Well, that's an interesting thing. I got married later in life. I was 46 and she was 39 when we got married. So I was to that point where I thought, man, I'm never going to get married. And lo and behold, it happened. So if it can happen for me, those out there who are wondering if it can happen to you, yes, it can, most assuredly. I was really blessed to meet her, and we really just got along so great right off the bat. And I knew I was going to marry her. I think I bought the ring the month after I met her. And I knew it was going to happen. But anyway, yeah, she's a marvelous thinker, and she's trained in English. I was talking about Lewis. Remember how he was trained in both English and philosophy? Well, I'm trained in philosophy, and she's trained in English. So together, we're a little like so. What I find really nice about her training in English is that we'll think about an issue together because we talk about everything under the sun, and I do tend to approach things a little bit more philosophically. And she'll approach things, you might say, a little bit more imaginatively sometimes, and very creatively. And then together, it becomes this very fertile sort of discussion where we're kind of both kind of going up the same mountain, but from slightly different angles, and we can enable each other to see things that the other might miss. It's just kind of a beautiful picture of community and microcosm, it seems to me. So she's actually really easy to work with. She is always supportive, encouraging. She has great insight. She has a wonderful way with words. Really a beautiful writer. And I trust her as an editor. And I don't trust a lot of people to edit me, but I really do trust her. I just know that if I write something and I can put it into her hand, she'll make it better. And she always does. And she's also just very effective at coming up with very good, apt illustrations from literature. So, you can come up with, say, a thought experiment or something to illustrate a point in philosophy, but there's an advantage, it seems to me, with using examples from literature because they tend to be richer and thicker, and they have a little bit more weight to them. She's very good at that. So I'll explain something sometimes to her, and I'll say, now, can you think of an example? And she'll think about it, and invariably she comes back with some impeccably good example, and then I'll let her write that part, and then we'll kick it back and forth. And the collaboration really has proven to be both enjoyable and very productive.
Oh, that's really cool. So in writing the book, can you tell us a little bit about kind of who your audience was? And by the way, I know from the book that your audience was not dead people or zombies, but I would like to know who the book was actually for. Who did you guys, when you decided to, put this book together, who did you have in mind?
Sure. Yeah, this book had a very specific target, which was a broader audience than the audience that Jerry Walls and I had tried to reach with some books that we had done. So, Jerry and I had written Good God, and we wrote God and Cosmos, and we were in the process of writing a book on the history of the moral argument. So those are 3 of the 4 books that we're planning in our tetralogy on the moral argument with an academic press. But along the way, it dawned on me that we could reach a bigger audience with these important ideas, and we really should. But it's going to take some intentionality to write a book that's a little bit more accessible. Mm-hmm. So I approached IVP in this case, and with this kind of idea, and they liked it. And so the idea was we're writing for probably still a relatively educated audience, but not just graduate students or academics or scholars, but really folks who are willing to put in the work and time and effort it takes to get these ideas. But we tried to make them more accessible. Now, I would say, in retrospect, looking back, it seems to me that we could write a yet more accessible book, and maybe that's something that we'll try down the line. You could, when you get a PhD, you guys, when you get all steeped in these ideas, and you kind of can lose your audience very, very easily along the way, and it really does take some serious efforts to take that stuff that you've learned and kind of build that bridge back to folks, who lack some of that training. And you got to work hard to lose the jargon and whatnot. And that's easier said than done. It really was a blessing to work in that philosophy and pop culture series, because right out of graduate school, which is when you're at your worst in terms of using the jargon and everything that you've just learned in graduate school, Bill was forcing me, like, how would you say this, in a way, just to someone who doesn't have a college degree, how do you make this clear? And increasingly, I'm of the view that, the more effective you are able to say what you have to say in a way that's understandable to someone without the technical training, the better grasp you yourself have on those ideas. And so it's a good exercise for all of us as communicators, as educators, as evangelists, as apologists, to cultivate that talent.
That's some good tips right there. So we talked about the sort of the goal or the audience you're gearing that towards. What's your overarching argument or goal through the book, would you say?
Yeah, we have a fourfold moral argument. it had first been put into the book God and Cosmos, but we wanted to put it here into this book in a way that was a little bit more clear and widely available, accessible. It also, though, integrated aspects of the Good God book. Let me pause. When you do moral apologetics, it seems to me there are three different tasks that you have to do. You have to predicate the whole thing on something like moral realism. So you might want to spend some time arguing for moral realism. In other words, there really is this objective set of, say, moral duties and moral values and the like, right? So if there isn't, then your moral argument's going to have a hard time kind of getting off the ground, right? And then you need to defend theistic ethics, right? The effort to root ethics in God in one sense or another against various objections, and give positive reasons to think that there are, principled reasons for taking seriously this notion that at the foundation of ethical truth is, nothing less than God himself. And the third task is then to critique the alternatives, especially, say, secular alternative ethical theories. And you might want to extend that argument eventually. I haven't done this a great deal, but I hope to do more later, to critiquing non-Christian religious alternative ethical foundations. So anyway, those are the three tasks, right? So in our book, Good God, we defended theistic ethics against objections and tried to give some positive reasons for it. In God and Cosmos, we extended the argument and argued against various secular alternatives, And by the way, then we threw in a history of the moral argument, which was fun. But we're now working on an argument defending moral realism. Right? So in this particular book, what you have is just a little, the one you're talking about that I did with my wife, Morals of the Story. We have a little bit of the history of the moral argument. We have 2 chapters devoted to that. And that was just sort of on my mind because it provides kind of a rich backdrop for the discussion, because the history is a lot richer than a lot of people realize. And there's a little bit by way of defending moral realism, but not much. But we realize that's a bigger task that we have to take on later. And Jerry and I are working on that now. Then we included some critiques of alternative secular ethical theories, right? And then primarily what we did was give this fourfold moral argument. Why is it that morality in various of its aspects points to God? And the 4 aspects involve moral facts like objective moral values and duties, but other things too, moral regrets, moral freedom, moral rights, and so forth. Whole panoply of concepts, really. Moral knowledge, that's the sort of the second tier of our fourfold structure. How is it that moral knowledge points to God? And guys like Angus Ritchie and Angus Manouge and R. Scott Smith and others have given epistemic variants of the moral argument that's got lots and lots of potential. And the last 2 parts, the third and fourth of the fourfold structure, are what John Hare calls the 2 aspects of Kantian moral faith. One has to do with are the holy the happy? Is there ultimate correspondence or convergence between holiness and happiness, right? Remember, Kant said that the ultimate good for us as creatures in both the phenomenal and noumenal realms is that we be both moral and virtuous and happy. Like psychologically, you might say, well, it doesn't matter if you're happy, you should just be virtuous, right? But we're hardwired to care about our happiness. And the beautiful thing is Christianity offers an impeccable reason to think that there is an ultimate convergence and correspondence between happiness and holiness. And Sidgwick said, that this is the dualism of practical reason. If you can't answer this question, the very rational foundations of morality get compromised, because ultimately morality wouldn't be a fully rational enterprise unless commitment to it corresponded with your ultimate fulfillment, right? Again, Christianity, I think better than any other worldview out there, can provide a really good explanation of how this is so. And then the fourth aspect is the question of the performative matter of, can we actually be moral? All of us fail. All of us fail. Remember C.S. Lewis, Book 1, Mere Christianity? He said that there are these 2 facts on which, ride our understanding of the whole of the universe. The fact that there is an objective moral law, and 2, that we fall short of. Invariably, we fall short of it. And this creates 3 needs within us. as human beings, and they're deep existential human needs. And by the way, this is where I think moral apologetics really encompasses both philosophical and cultural apologetics, or imaginative apologetics. It really covers both. There are three basic existential moral needs that I want to emphasize then right now in light of our having fallen short of the moral ideal. We need to be forgiven for having fallen short. Two, we need to be changed, right? Because we don't just want to be forgiven. We actually want to be made able to match up to our moral demands. And if ought implies can, if there's a kind of normativity to ethics like we're inclined to think there is, there really has to be an account for how it is we can close this gap between the best we can do and what morality requires. And John Hare calls that the moral gap. Anyway, you need to be forgiven. You need to be changed, and not just changed a little. Ultimately, right, we don't want some vicious, selfish part of us to continue to exist. We want all of that ugly, immoral, unrighteous stuff within us to be expunged and excised, right? Amen. Eventually, we don't just want to be changed, right? We want to be transformed completely. We want to be perfected. But forgiveness, transformation, and perfection, right? All of these, just any secularist would tell you, these are just basic human needs. You don't have to be a Christian to believe that. We can all recognize it as human beings, that we have these deep felt, radical, existential, moral needs. And Christianity provides the perfect antidote in each case. By God's grace, we can be forgiven, we can be changed, and ultimately completely transformed. And every last vestige of sin be removed. We entirely conform to the image of Jesus. What an exciting vision. You see, this particular variant of the moral argument, I actually see is the most naturally kind of leading right to proclamation of the gospel. I mean, it gets you right there. And you're just considering an aspect of morality that all of us as human beings can recognize, and it's the perfect prelude to proclamation of the gospel. And you can't always say that about every argument for God's existence out there, You can give the cosmological argument. It's not like, therefore, are you ready to for God to forgive your sins? Like, there's a bit of a gap there, right?
Yeah.
But this particular version, this particular variant of the moral argument, I'm very excited about because, it really does provide the perfect segue to proclaiming the gospel. So those are the four aspects of the moral argument that I emphasize. It's a very rich, fertile topic, as you can see. And this is the vision you see of the center at HBU in moral apologetics. We actually think that there's such cutting-edge work to be done in all of these areas, including extending the moral argument all the way to Christianity, not just to theism, per se, and to provide a community in which this work is getting done, maybe for generations to come if Jesus tarries. There's great work to be done. And Al Flanagan asked, what's the best argument that you consider there to be for God's existence? He says the moral argument. And William Lane Craig, when asked, when you go to college campuses, which is the argument that has the most effect? His favorite argument is the cosmological argument, but he admits that in his experience in college campuses, the one that most affects people is the moral argument.
Yeah.
And there's been a real resurgence of interest, too, in the moral argument over the last decade or so. It's been exciting to see.
The moral argument gets personal, and that's why it has such an effect.
That's right. And there's something also deeply experiential about it, not unlike an argument from aesthetics or beauty, right? It's our experience of moral beauty, of goodness, and also of badness, right, that makes us aware of the need for this ultimate standard. And by the way, part of the moral evidence that we have to account for is the evil and the suffering in this world, right? And so you might see the moral argument as sort of in a zero-sum game, head-to-head battle with the problem of evil. And the problem of evil is thought by many to be this intractable, problem. But I actually think, like Kant did, contra Hume, that when they're head-to-head, the moral argument is actually going to win. But the center at HBU is going to be about making that case and making it effectively from professional scholars down to elementary school children, making that case.
We mentioned maybe a common moral argument what we would hear from like William Lane Craig about objective values and duties existing, and they can't exist without God. I'm just wondering, because that might be one of the only things that comes to mind for certain people who are familiar with just a general apologetics and whatnot. if someone asked you, David, you're into the moral arguments, you've seen them all, you're talking to someone, what do you think is the most persuasive? How would you present that? Or was there a concise presentation that you find is most impactful?
I think what you need to do when you're in a conversation with somebody is to see where they're coming from and see what their convictions are, what they care about, and then tailor what you have to say to them, because what's going to be the most persuasive will be person relative, right? The most persuasive to one person isn't going to necessarily be the most persuasive to everybody. So have those conversations, spend the time getting to know them, listen to what they have to say, and then gently, probe with questions, their accounts of, say, the prescriptive value of moral obligations or something. I mean, where does that authority come from if there really are these things that are oblige us to behave in certain ways, or if there really are behaviors that are morally hideous, and not just like they produce pain, but predicated on the idea that, and it's morally, objectively speaking, bad to intentionally produce pain needlessly, right? Unearth their assumptions and such, ask them to provide accounts, and then gently show how their very convictions are much more at home in a theistic world than an atheistic world. If, for example, they believe in moral freedom, and yet they claim to be naturalists, right? How is it that they're going to account for the kind of requisite freedom to choose to do the right instead of the wrong, or the good instead of the bad, if we're thought of as complicated organic machines, whose every action is determined, by the antecedent conditions and physical laws of the universe? I mean, the laws of the physical universe. You know what I mean? So you can help them see things just based on what they are already kind of committed to, and help them to see the implications, spell that out, and then demonstrate the power of a theistic explanation generally, and a Christian explanation more particularly, in accounting for authoritative moral obligations, objective values, human freedom, our need for forgiveness and transformation and perfection, the ultimate consistency between rationality and holiness, happiness and holiness. I'm probably not the best person to ask for a concise answer to your question here, because it seems to me the more training one has in this area, what you can do is say, wherever this person is, we can meet them there, and we can build a bridge from there to where we'd like to see them go.
I like what you're saying there about things being person relative and finding out where people are at and asking questions along there. When I hear moral arguments, I tend to hear a lot about obligations, values, duties. One thing I want to ask about is the concepts of guilt and shame. We all seem to feel obligations or duties, and then we use that to point to, hey, where are these coming from? Can you talk about guilt and shame? I have never heard anyone speak on maybe the difference between those and what role they may play and how they point us towards God.
Yeah, sure. Bobby Conway just did his dissertation at Birmingham on a variant of the moral argument predicated on guilt. And it was good work. So guilt is this recognition that we have somehow fallen short of a standard, right? And this is a very odd phenomenon in a naturalistic world. Who was George Mavrodes years ago wrote a piece along these lines, and he talked about how odd it would be for us to have these experiences of guilt in a world that's just, say, a naturalistic world, what we call the Russellian world after Bertrand Russell, right? Where everything that we do is just sort of determined, by the laws of the world. And yet we feel like we shouldn't have done certain things, or we should have done certain things that we failed to do, right? Or moral regret is in the same category, right? And William James years ago used this example of a man killing his wife. And he said, this might be, I suppose, a perfect natural fit with the world if everything is as the atheists say it is. And then in one of the biggest understatements I've ever read, he goes, but it seems an awfully bad moral fit, right? So, yeah. What doesn't fit? I mean, you have to ask questions about coherence here. Is it really coherent to think that we're just physically determined to do all that we do, and yet there's such a thing as moral obligations which say we ought to do such and such? Well, how can we do such and such if we're physically determined to do, say, something else. So we have this experience of guilt, and for many of us, it's a belief of deep ingression. I mean, it's something that we're most convicted about. We really genuinely think that on at least some occasions, we genuinely flubbed it up. We genuinely messed it up. Now, of course, if you run into someone who says, I don't believe that I ever have, right? I don't experience guilt. I mean, that's possible, and you have to have that conversation. But most people will say, well, of course, we all fall short, right? And do you feel guilty? Well, of course I feel guilty. And then I suppose one question that will arise is it more than just a feeling? Or to put it another way, I suppose, if it is a feeling, does the feeling track reality? Right? So is there an objective condition of guilt in addition to the feeling of guilt? And does the feeling of guilt point toward it? Now, again, there are, of course, occasions where you might feel something like false guilt, right? You might have an overactive superego, and you really feel guilty for something that you really shouldn't feel guilty. Maybe you were raised to believe that something was wrong. It's really not wrong, and you're just mistaken. And other occasions, it's true for various explanations. You might fail to feel guilty when you are guilty, we're inclined to think, right? But at least on many occasions, or at least some occasions, many of us are inclined to think that our deep feelings of guilt point to an objective condition of guilt. And at that point, then, what gets introduced is what we were discussing, our need for forgiveness, and then transformation, and ultimately even perfection. And what Christianity says is that's not just a Pollyannish hope. That's there are actually principled reasons to think that our moral experiences are making us privy to aspects of reality here.
Very good.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned near the end, the beginning of the interview, was you had done some work earlier in your career on the Euthyphro dilemma, yes. Plato's kind of famous Euthyphro dilemma. That's kind of one of the popular responses that I get to the moral argument. Can you kind of walk us through what is the Euthyphro dilemma and maybe kind of what your thinking is on it, how you would respond to it?
Sure. Yeah. So in the original context, Socrates is questioned by Euthyphro, and Euthyphro, believes in the gods of the Greek pantheon and such, and thinks that he should obey them and such. And Socrates was a little more skeptical of all of that. And Euthyphro, of course, was going to sue his own father for something, and Socrates was a little appalled at this. And so he said, well, you must have, as he was wont to do, Socrates was like, well, you must have a very clear understanding of justice and piety and so forth, right? So, and I don't, so explain these things to me. And Euthyphro's like, well, I most certainly do understand these things, and let me explain them to you. So, first he said, well, it's doing what I'm doing. Going after someone who engaged in wrongdoing. And Socrates said, well, I don't just want an example. I want the general principle. And so then he said, well, it's what the gods love. And then Socrates says, but according to these legends that you claim to believe, the gods love different things. So then Euthyphro changed it again. He said, well, the pious or the holy is what all the gods love, and the impious and the unholy is what all the gods hate. Okay. Now, Socrates wasn't very convinced at this point, but he kind of pivoted and he said, well, let me ask you this question then. Do the gods love something because it's pious, or is it pious because all the gods love? And to express that question, say in contemporary monotheistic terms, and say in terms of divine commands or something like that, you might say something like, does God command something because it's moral, or is it moral because God commands it? And the thought is, either way you go, you've got a dilemma, right? If you say God commands something because it's moral, that makes it seem like morality is not really rooted in God after all, right? It's already kind of pre-existing, and God just comes along and clues us in as to its contents. But if something is moral because God commands it, then that raises the specter of arbitrariness. Because, what if God were to tell us to torture children for fun, or something like that? So either morality is independent of God or arbitrary and capricious. I think a lot depends on what do we mean by God. I mean, there's a big difference between, say, the God of Christianity and the gods of the Greek pantheon. I mean, those guys had issues, right? Whereas the God of Christianity, we're told, is impeccable, is wholly without sin. His very nature is love in the Trinitarian relationship between the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. God is love. So you're talking about this greatest possible being kind of picture of God that's simply not going to be as susceptible to the sort of arbitrariness concerns that did plague the gods of the Greek pantheon. So I divide the good and the right, and I say I actually think that God is the good in some ultimate sense. And so he's never going to command something that goes contrary to his nature. And we're actually taught this in the Bible, that God can't deny himself. So God can't command us to torture children for fun or something like that, we're inclined to think, because it would go contrary to his nature. And some people might object, yeah, but God can do anything. Well, no, he can do anything that makes sense for him to do, and that's just not one among them. His ability to do something like that would actually be tantamount to a denial of his nature. And so that's problematic. It's an example of his perfection that is beyond the pale. That's something that he would never do, never could do, I don't think. Just like he can't commit suicide, he can't sin, and so forth, right? So with respect to the good, I think God is the good. I do tend to be a divine command theorist, so I say with respect to the moral duties, what God commands us to do, we're obligated to do. But usually, at least, what he commands us to do is something good, but divine command theory is one way in which to demarcate what, among all the things that are good to do, what more specifically is our duty to do, because we're not obligated to do all good things, right? That's the category of supererogation, right? Some things are praiseworthy to do, but not blameworthy if you don't do, that whole thing. But you don't have to, here's the thing, to be a moral apologist, you don't necessarily have to be a divine command theorist. I happen to be drawn to that particular theory, but you could be a natural lawyer, you could be a divine will theorist, you can be a divine desire theorist. There's all manner of ways in which you might think that morality is rooted in God. And what's cool is we can all get together as moral apologists and say, hey, there are some fine-grained distinctions among us as theistic ethicists, but we all agree that in some essential way, morality depends upon God, and we can do moral apologetics together.
Mm-hmm. So you would agree then that the dilemma is ultimately a false one?
Oh, yeah, I don't think it constitutes an intractable objection.
So one other question about that. I kind of hear conflicting. Now, I'm not a professional philosopher. I'm just a layman apologist. And so I kind of hear conflicting reports. Some people will kind of claim, oh, the Euthyphro dilemma is kind of dead in academia today. And then other people will claim that it's kind of has this resurgence going among philosophers of religion. Kind of what's happening at the academic level with the Euthyphro dilemma? Is it still pretty potent, or has it kind of lost its potency over the years? Does that make sense?
Sure. It's a good question. And of course, I think that different philosophers think different things. I don't think that it's a very good objection if you have a thick enough conception of who God is and whatnot. And I think that you can spell out a version of theistic ethics, or maybe more than one version of theistic ethics, that's largely impervious to objections inspired by the Euthyphro dilemma. But among secularists, opinions are divided, of course, but there are some who continue to be convinced by the argument, But here's a big reason. This is just my little pet theory as to some of the reasons why. I think that a lot of people's perception of the Euthyphro dilemma is based on what they read in intro philosophy books. And I think in most intro philosophy books, what happens is they don't want to get into the weeds, right? And so they raise theistic ethics, and then they say, oh, and of course, here you have the standard Euthyphro objection. And then they might say something, they might write a paragraph or two, or they might not at all. They'll just leave it hanging, right? And they're like, well, but of course it's just an intro, so we're not going to continue that conversation for long. And the reason I'm saying this is, way back when I wrote on the Euthyphro dilemma, I started there. I started with the basic philosophy texts, and I looked at dozens upon dozens of them. And nearly to a book, every one of them acted like the Euthyphro dilemma posed an intractable objection to theistic ethics, but it was done at a very superficial level. And I can almost understand it. I can almost understand, if you're writing an intro text, why you don't want to get into it that much, right?
Right.
But when you actually wade into the literature on the thing, it's anything but that simple. It's anything but that simple. But I suspect that what has sort of been propagated, intentionally or not, is this sort of general vague idea that, oh, well, the Euthyphro dilemma is really problematic. And what we've been arguing for the last dozen years, Jerry and I and others, is that no, let's slow down. Theistic ethics is not dead after all. Certainly not because of the Euthyphro dilemma. And I think that the resurgence of interest in the moral argument, which is partially predicated on believing that theistic ethics actually works and isn't confronted with these intractable objections, is good evidence of a move in the right direction.
All right. I have a question. You're mentioning introductory philosophy texts and such, and so it brings to mind this question about, hey, if I'm someone who's studying the moral argument, arguments for moral knowledge, what are some of the go-to philosophers on that? What would be like, a good starting point to look into that realm?
Oh, yeah, sure. I would suggest that they might want to check out our website, moralapologetics.com, moralapologetics.com, because we have lots and lots of resources there, and that can help people. And one of the things that you'll find out there is an article by Angus Manouge. He used to be president of the Evangelical Philosophical Society, really good philosopher, dear man. So he's got a version in real short compass of an epistemic moral argument, and we have that piece out there at the website, and there are lots of other resources to tap into there as well. The two philosophers that are leaping to mind, well, I might mention three. Richard Swinburne actually thinks that an epistemic version of the moral argument works, and he's actually skeptical of some of the other versions of the moral argument, but he thinks this one works.
Right.
I disagree with him about some of those other ones, but I agree with him on the epistemic version. So if you look at his book, The Existence of God, there's a chapter in which he talks about both the argument from consciousness and the moral argument, and you'll see what he has to say about the epistemic version of the moral argument there, which is helpful. Then R. Scott Smith at Biola, he's written some books that feature an epistemic version of the moral argument, and that's well worth looking into. And then another Angus. Earlier I mentioned Angus Manouge. Now I've got Angus Ritchie, and he's over in England, and he did his degree at Oxford, and he wrote a book called From Morality to Metaphysics, I believe it's called, From Morality to Metaphysics, and it essentially constitutes an elaborate epistemic moral argument, or at least defense of theistic ethics from epistemic objections. So it could be deployed as part of an epistemic moral argument. So those are three that leap to mind right off the bat.
Very good. Chad, do you have any further moral questions?
Yeah, I think my last one, before you guys talk about Harry Potter, my last one was just obviously you've studied, I almost feel strange calling it the moral argument because it's a family of arguments, but you've studied the moral arguments extensively. What would you say is kind of one of the biggest misconceptions about the moral argument?
Oh, yes. I think by far, it's this idea that, what you're saying is that if you don't believe in God, you can't be moral. And that's not really the point at all. It has to do instead with, what is our account of the objective existence of these moral facts and phenomena, and what provides the best, most robust explanation of them, right? And it's not at all like a slight on people who don't believe in God. And I know plenty of people who don't believe in God who are, comparatively speaking, very moral people. And I know plenty of believers, whose morals are questionable, right? So that's not the point at all. Now, that said, if you want to be more than just forgiven, and you really want to believe in radical moral transformation and hold out principled hope for complete moral transformation, ultimately, and something like perfection, on a naturalistic perspective, that's inevitably going to be a pipe dream. But on Christianity, it's a promise. It will happen. So there is something to be said along those lines of, it's not like the people who believe in God are intrinsically better than those who don't. Obviously not, right? We're all sinners, and we all fall short. In fact, we're all radical sinners. Clay Jones did a lot of reading about genocides and such, in the history of the world. And one of his most compelling points is we're all of us Auschwitz enabled. We come into this world capable of the most hideous of things, the most hideous behaviors, all of us. We are all radical sinners in need of God's grace to be forgiven and then to be changed, and ultimately changed to the uttermost. And Christianity holds out that promise, and there are good reasons to believe it to be true. So again, it's the true myth, right? It's true, and we have principled reasons to believe it. And it also speaks to us at our deepest existential levels and fires our imaginations and gets us excited about the prospect of being able to become the people that down deep intuitively we sense we were meant to be.
Well put.
That's great stuff. Well, we'll definitely point people to the resources at moralapologetics.com. Now, I want to shift gears for a few minutes, and we want to be respectful for your time as well. We appreciate you being with us. You wrote a book called Harry Potter and Philosophy, If Aristotle Ran Hogwarts. So normally I wouldn't be too interested in Harry Potter of all things. I could take it or leave it. But there is this fact that I'm reading it to my son right now. He's 6 years old. And, the way I grew up, anything having to do with witches or warlocks or spells was like, oh no, that's terrible. It's of the devil. You don't even touch that. Now, my view isn't that way at the moment. I'm thinking, well, let's engage with that. I'm not doing spells today or becoming a witch, but I would like to engage with something in culture. I would like to be right there with my son as we look at it. I'm enjoying the story and the characters and things. But, and obviously I think that you're looking at it in your book, looking at it, the different things you get, the different philosophical ideas that are able to be drawn from the story overall. Can you talk a little bit about this book, your goal in it, and what your thoughts are about how we approach things in culture like this that some Christians would tend not to want to touch, or they would want to put it on the, don't read list.
Right. Yeah, my mother was one of those. In fact, she went to her grave saying things to me like, "I don't know why you ever bothered with that devil stuff."
Oh wow.
Yeah, she was definitely old school there. Well, I might have mentioned this. So yeah, after graduation, I was really blessed to get a job right out of the gate at King's College in Northeast Pennsylvania. One of my colleagues is Bill Irwin, who's a dear friend, and Bill's the one who started the Philosophy and Pop Culture series at Open Court, and his vision was to use the medium of pop culture to get people interested in the ideas of philosophy. Like he puts it, it kind of helps the medicine go down easier, a little sugar. Anyway, it's where people are at, and I think Bill doesn't happen to be a believer, but I think his idea is profoundly resonant with Christian teachings about incarnational outreach. You sort of go to where the people are, and millions of people. Because this was some time back, of course. This was my first book, way back with 2006 or something. Millions upon millions of people all across the country, all around the world, were reading Harry Potter. And we could have just ignored it and just sort of, with furrowed brow, washed our hands of it and walked away. But it seemed to me at the time that it was a really lost opportunity if we did that. At the same time, my mother was saying all these things. And not that I would always be convinced by my mother, but it made me wonder, what on earth is so bad about these books, as I hadn't read them. So I sat down at Barnes & Noble in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania one day, and I picked it up and I started reading it without even buying it, because I was like, I'm not sure I want to contribute to it. It might be bad. I started reading it, and of course, 3 chapters in, I'm wanting to wear a pointy hat, loving it, and I never much looked back after that. Now, I addressed some of those concerns, by the way, in my chapter in that book. By the way, I didn't write the book. I mean, so much. I edited it, so a number of people contributed, and I wrote one chapter. And I took on this objection that it was spiritually bad and basically morally bad. And I try to answer both of those objections in that particular chapter. But what I would want to say is, in general, I think we can relax a little bit as Christians and see these as opportunities to use these pieces of popular culture to do outreach. This is where the people are, and this is something Jesus would do. I mean, he would go to where the people were, or he'd inspire them to come to where he was. And I think that we should do the same, and we should be less motivated in general by fear than by sort of a redemptive look at these things, right? What is it that we can glean from such pieces of popular culture that might be of value? What's good? Maybe what's not so good. We don't have to be fearful of it, though. We can then talk about it, and we can have that conversation with others. So I think that was around the time that I really began to see the value of reaching out in this sort of incarnational way, of building bridges with our secular interlocutors, not being afraid of using pieces of popular culture if need be to do so. I mean, we're called to communicate. We're called to be persuasive. We're called to engage people's hearts and minds. And this was a great way in which to do it. And I really don't have any regrets of having done that work. And I would encourage more Christians to be open to the possibilities of employing in innovative ways these points of resonance we have with secular culture.
From the perspective of parenting, if you will, I appreciate what you're saying there. But like you're saying, if culture's there, go there. In the incarnational model, I suppose the voice in the back of my head that would be saying, "Oh yeah, but it's a lot different than bringing it into your house and exposing your children to this." If you have a choice, then you don't go near it. Would sort of be like the opposite side of the spectrum. I suppose my approach is, no, this is in culture already. They're going to be exposed to it. If they're going to be exposed to it, I'm going to be right there talking them through it, being aware of it, coaching them, showing them scriptures and, making sure they're not going off the rails and buying the pointy hat. So what's your view like along that line or advice?
Yes. Right. Yeah, I think that in parenting, you need to be wise. I mean, maybe if they're 6 or 7 years old, they're not yet old enough, to look at some of that stuff. But when they get maybe a little older, they're probably going to be exposed to it in one way or another. And if you tell them that they can't, of course, that's only going to tend to increase their desire to do it behind your back. I think the much preferable option would be to study it with them, read it with them, show them that you're not fearful of these things, and that as a Christian you can read this stuff and you can appreciate the good stuff, and you can also be mindful of potential pitfalls as you go. But I think it's a great teachable moment for parents to read those books with their kids and together to explore these questions.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation and appreciate your time so much, Dr. Baggett. Just want to ask you if you'd be willing to do something. It wasn't on my script, so to speak. But, when you were talking about the moral, might be me in closing now, when you were talking about the three needs that we all have, one is to be forgiven, the next to be changed, and finally to be transformed. And I've never done this on the podcast before because I kind of tend to think that people who are listening are Christians. But I wondered if there's anybody out there listening who's like, this moral argument kind of does get me at the heart here. And it's something that's, I've wondered about. I wondered if you would share what how you would present the gospel to someone who seems to be struggling with that feeling of tension where they're like, I do need forgiveness. I do need to be transformed. How would you want to speak to them?
Yeah, well, I guess my preference is to emphasize to them that God loves them. And to me, this is the absolutely most important sort of insight behind the whole moral apologetic endeavor, that God is good, that God truly is good. And I spent years teaching at a seminary, and I found a number of seminary students who were preparing for the ministry harboring deep doubts, not about God's love for others, but about God's love for themselves. Mm-hmm. And of course, people who are not already believers might well think that God is just a God of, harsh morality, a God of judgment, and all of that. And judgment has its place, right? There is going to be a reckoning and all of that. That is an absolutely central truth. You'll remember in Acts 17, Paul makes this clear about the coming judgment. And what was interesting is he was in Athens, and if you go back to Socrates believed that there was going to be a coming judgment. So actually, I suspect that our intuitions about a coming judgment might even actually be a function of general revelation, not just special revelation. Down deep intuitively, we know it's coming. And that fills us with fear and apprehension, of course. But I think it can also fill us with profound hope and anticipation of something good if we realize that the same God who is going to uphold a certain standard has enabled us to meet that standard, has paid the price himself, and has made possible our forgiveness, our complete transformation, not just forgiveness for our sins, but deliverance from sin, so much so that it will culminate in perfection. God created us to be co-lovers with himself, to find our calling in this world in relationship to him, to learn to love him with all of our heart and soul and mind and strength, and our neighbors as ourselves. He has made provision for this. It's the kind of God he is. And he really does love each and every one of us. And that is a profound truth. In fact, that's like the most profound truth that you can possibly imagine. He doesn't just love us. He even likes us, even Chad. Every one of us.
I know, that's pretty hard to believe, no doubt.
I know. It's an incredible, liberating truth that's the kind of God that we serve. And that's been the biggest takeaway. In my life working, I've had the privilege to work in this area, for decades now. This is the sort of the theme of my whole ministry, you might say. Not just that God exists. Even Satan knows that. But that God is perfectly good, perfectly loving. And I'm not suggesting anything like he's easy on sin or whatever. Sin is an affront to love. And that's why it's got to be ultimately expunged completely and entirely. And that's why God has made provision to do just that. Stop resisting it. Open yourself up to that. And God will enable each and every one of us, as we do so, to become the people that we were intended to be, where there is the deepest fulfillment imaginable. And that's what I would say.
Well, thank you so much. Is there anything that we may have left out, or any resources you'd want to point people to beyond the moralapologetics.com website?
We're going to start a new website for the center before too long, and we're looking forward to that. I would also encourage people to go on out to the website and sign up for the newsletter for the Center for Moral Apologetics. The second newsletter is going to be going out, I think, tomorrow, actually. And so that'll probably be coming out about every other month. That will keep people apprised of the ongoing activities of the center, as well as the School of Christian Thought at HBU and the Department of Apologetics.
Excellent. Okay, Chad, we just finished our interview with David Baggett. What did you think?
To be honest with you, I was super impressed. First of all, love his obvious heart for people who do not know Christ. I love his passion for the moral argument. It comes through. And I was blown away by all the opportunities that are coming from HBU, especially for those who are interested in studying the moral argument more in depth. So I found it encouraging and very informative.
Yeah, man. Center for Moral Apologetics. That's amazing. Cool. It's like I'm thinking, they got everything distance program. Let's see. Let me get on there and start looking,
Exactly. I know.
I wonder how much that costs. I need to do it. So, Chad, the other thing that I want to tell people who are listening right now, he did say something about what he thought of William Lane Craig's moral argument and how he would do it differently. So we're gonna let We recorded that afterwards, after the podcast. And so we're going to stick that on the end after our little outro here. So stay tuned, and we'll share that with you at the end. So yeah, Dr. David Baggett, professor of philosophy and director of the Center for Moral Apologetics at Houston Baptist University. A reminder to everybody listening, you can find his stuff at moralapologetics.com, and any links that we've mentioned, stuff from this show, you can find it on today's show notes at apologetics315.com. Thanks for joining us, and for any questions you've sent in, thank you for those as well. We'll be addressing those in future episodes. If you have a question you'd like us to address, or just a message for us, feedback whether good or bad, you can email us at podcast@apologetics315.com, or leave us a message on SpeakPipe, speakpipe.com/apologetics315. Just go to the podcast page for today's episode and hit the link for leaving us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we will read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers.
It'll be big, Brian. It'll be very big.
Yes. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. Please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. I know I have. And remember, you can find all kinds of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com or over at Chad's truthbomb.blogspot.com. That's Truthbomb Apologetics. This is Brian Auten
and Chad Gross
for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.
So, Dr. Baggett, what's the difference between, say, William Lane Craig's moral argument and your moral argument?
Chad, what an excellent question. Okay, so there's a few, right? So one, and I love William Lane Craig, and I love his work. I mean, I think he's such a top-notch guy, in so many areas. But we do have a few slight differences. And so, yeah, he tends to focus on objective moral values and duties. Objective moral values and duties. And that's sort of part of mine, my fourfold argument, the moral facts bit. I talk about those things, objective moral values, objective moral duties. And then I like to talk about things like, intrinsic human value and human rights and human freedoms and moral regrets. I mean, all of these are important moral facts in need of explanation. But it's more than just that. But that's what he focuses on. And that's fine. It's not a criticism, just a little observation. And another sort of methodological difference is he tends to use a deductive version of the argument, which is to say an argument where the premises logically lead to the conclusion with kind of airtight certainty. And that's a way to go. And it may well, in certain circumstances and contexts, be the best way to go. If your time is limited, maybe you're in a debate and you just have to be pithy and concise and succinct, that might be the way to go. If you have the time, though, I tend to prefer a more abductive approach in my own version of the argument, where I don't talk about the only explanation or anything like that, and I don't try to act like there's an airtight case from premises to conclusion. I'm instead a little bit more inclined to speak in terms of, well, what's a good explanation, or what's an adequate explanation, or what's a robust explanation, or something like that. And I think one of the advantages is it doesn't make people feel backed into a corner, right? Because they might say, well, okay, but whether or not your explanation is better than mine is one thing, but mine is an explanation, at least. And the fact is, I think that our secular friends can come up with some explanations that do have some explanatory value of various moral phenomena. And the reason is simple. They have this world to appeal to. Moreover, if we're right as Christians, this is a world that's only possible because God created it and God sustains it in existence. And think about who you're talking to. You might be talking to an unbeliever, but you're still talking to someone who was made in God's image, someone who has infinite value and worth because God loves them and has created them in his image and after his likeness for a reason and for a purpose. And they've been equipped with the epistemic faculties to recognize certain moral phenomena in this world. It's not a surprise that they're going to be able to appeal to certain features of this world and explain some things about morality, by talking, say, about the satisfactions of morality and how that can bolster our commitment to take moral obligations seriously, or what have you, or the need for social harmony or whatever. Those things are not without explanatory value. We have access to all of them as well, but as theists, we also have access to the creator God who made us in his image and for reasons and purposes, and who is perfectly loving and perfectly good, and who cares about our well-being and our moral well-being, and who desires us to become the very best versions of ourselves that he intended us to be. We just have a tremendous storehouse of additional resources that will constitute, I think, over time, if you have some time to spell it out, the considerably better explanation of the full panoply of moral phenomena in question. And so I don't go with a presuppositionalist approach where it's the only possible explanation. I don't really go with the deductive approach that says, it's the only explanation. I prefer language of best explanation or better explanation. I think it's a little bit more bridge building. I think it's a little less off-putting. And I think that it lends itself to finding common ground with our secular friends that we can share together, and then gradually and respectfully move the conversation from there without making it seem like it's a zero-sum game where we win, they lose. We're on their side, after all, right? We're really trying to help fire their imaginations so that they can realize that their deepest moral impulses are not idle pipe dreams, but they really do point to ultimate reality.
Things I thought could never happen. Me in a punk band?
What?
We Are Lady Parts, a new original comedy streaming only on Peacock.
A confused mix of hash anthems and sour girl power. Syra, vocals. Aisha, drummer. Bisma, bassist. Mumtaz, band manager. And me, Amina, lead guitar.
You were really good until you puked all over the front row. Ew.
We Are Lady Parts. All episodes streaming now. Only on Peacock. Peacock fuels your true crime obsession with exclusive new originals. John Wayne Gacy, Devil in Disguise.
Clowns can get away with murder.
And Epstein's Shadow, Ghislaine Maxwell.
She inherited Jeffrey Epstein's secrets.
Plus the most bingeable crime series, Snapped. Sign up now at peacocktv.com.